Elijah of Buxton by Christopher Paul Curtis. Keeping Mr. John Holton Alive from Elijah of Buxton by Christopher Paul Curtis. What an interesting, beautiful, hope-filled place the Elgin settlement and Buxton mission of Raleigh was and is. Founded in 1849 by a white Presbyterian minister named Reverend William King, the settlement was first shared by Reverend King, 15 slaves whom he had inherited through his wife, and 6 escaped slaves who awaited them. Reverend King felt there was nowhere in the United States that these African American slaves could truly know liberty, so he purchased a 3-mile by 6-mile plot of land in southern Ontario on which he and the freed slaves could live. The population of Buxton at its height ranged from an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 escaped and freed people. Though there were a few other settlements of refugees from slavery in Canada at that time, Buxton proved to be the one that thrived. Even into the 21st century, several hundred descendants of the original settlers still live in the area, farming the land their ancestors hewed from the once thick Canadian forests. The relative success of Buxton can be attributed to 2 things. First is the will, determination, courage, and sheer appreciation of freedom that steeled the spines of the newly freed, largely African American residents. In the face of great opposition by some Canadians, they fought and worked hard to maintain the promise of the North Star. They took themselves from the horrors of Southern American slavery into the land of the free, Canada. Every day they awoke was filled with hardship. Every day they awoke was filled with the joy of freedom. In Legacy to Buxton, a detailed history of the settlement, author A.C. Robbins cites a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem to describe these brave people, and I can't think of a more fitting tribute. Not they who soar, but they who plod their rugged way unhelped to God, are heroes, not they who soar. The second reason the Buxton settlement thrived is the set of strict rules that were instituted by Reverend King. People who chose to live within the settlement's boundaries were required to purchase, with the assistance of very low interest loans, a minimum of 50 acres of land which they had to clear and drain. Their homes had to be a certain size with a minimum of 4 rooms and were set 33 feet apart from the road. The front of each home was to be planted with a flower garden, and the back was to have a vegetable garden or truck patch. Economically, Buxton was fiercely and deliberately self-sufficient and eventually had its own sawmill, potato mill, brickyard, post office, hotel, and school. There was even a 6-mile-long tram that carried lumber from Buxton down to Lake Erie, where it was loaded on ships to be sold through North America. Buxton School developed such a sterling reputation that many white families in the area withdrew their children from the local government schools and sent them to the Academy of Buxton instead. Many Native Canadian children also were educated at the school. A few days later, after supper, one of Mrs. Moe's twins came banging on the door. I answered. "Evening, Eli." "Evening, Eb." "Mr. Leroy told me to come here and tell you not to go direct to Mrs. Holton's land tonight." That was peculiar. I was supposed to help him again. "Did he say how come?" Eb said, "Uh-uh. You know Mr. Leroy. He never has much of anything to say. All he said was to tell you to come by the sawmill first." "Thank you, Eb. Tell your ma and pa I asked about 'em." When I got to the sawmill, Mr. Leroy and Mr. Polite were sitting next to a fresh-cut hunk of wood, about 4 feet long and 1 foot wide. Mr. Polite said, "Here he be. Evening, Eli." "Evening, Mr. Polite." "Evening, Mr. Leroy." Mr. Leroy said, "Evening, Elijah. I want you to look over this here writing 'fore I starts carving it. Mrs. Holton wants it to go over her door, and I ain't carving nothin' for no one, 'less somebody what reads tells me it makes sense. Folks ax you to carve something, then when you do it like they want and someone reads it to 'em, and it ain't nothing but jibber-jabber. They say they ain't gonna pay, and I done waste all that time. So see if this here's sensical." I could tell Mr. Leroy was mighty worked up about this. That was a whole month's worth of talking for him. He handed me a piece of paper that had rough writing and lots of cross-outs on it. I read, "These words is done, so no one won't never forget the loving memory of my husband, John Holton, what got whipped to death and killed on May the 7th, 1859, just 'cause he want to see what his family look like if they free. He be resting calm knowing his family done got through. The body won't never endure, but something inside all of us be so strong it always be flying." I said to Mr. Leroy, "Sir, some of these things do need to get changed. How long you gonna let me ponder on this afore I gotta tell you?" Mr. Polite said, "Ponder? Seemed to me if you was really some good at reading and writing, you wouldn't need no time to ponder nothing. Just change it up, 'cause it ain't ringing right to my ear." He turned to Mr. Leroy. "I told you, Leroy, we should have got that little Collins gal. That's one bright child there. This boy ain't too far from being daft." Mr. Leroy said, "Hold on, Henry. The boy say he needs some time. I'ma let him take his time. Mrs. Holton already suffered a lot. She don't need to be sufferin' no more 'cause of some jibber-jabber what's carved over her door." I showed Ma and Pa the paper Mrs. Holton had writ, and they told me it was a great honor to do this, and that I had to do the best job I could. Pa said, "You gonna have to help her take some of the bite out them words, Elijah. Her pain too fresh to be locking it up so hot and writing." Ma told me, "Poor Mr. Leroy gonna be carving for years to get all that down. But look, baby, some of them words is mine." I thought on it for the rest of the week. I filled pages and pages in my notebook, working on just the right words for Mrs. Holton. I thought about it when I was supposed to be studying, and when I was supposed to be doing chores. It even creeped up on me and made my rock fishing go real unpleasant for both me and the fish. I only chunked 4 out of 20. Worst, I sent 2 of 'em wobbling back into the water with their brains scrambled like eggs. After about a week, Mr. Leroy's patient ran out, and he said, "I'm starting to agree with Henry Polite. Don't seem like changing some words around going to take you all this time. Mrs. Holton been wondering where her sign's at. After your supper, come to the field and have them words ready, so I can get started, and write 'em down clear, too." It killed my appetite, but I finally got something writ down just after supper. Afore I gave it to Mr. Leroy, I ran over to Mr. Travis's home so he could see if there were any big mistakes. Mr. Travis changed 2 words, crossed out 3, put in some better punctuating, then said, "Admirable job, Mr. Freeman. Admirable job." Ma and Pa said it seemed pretty good to them, and when I told the words to Mr. Leroy, he didn't do nothing but grunt, which was saying a whole lot for him. It took him a while to carve all the letters and the wood, and the day it was finished he showed it to me. It was beautiful. He said, "She real partial to having things done fancy, don't want nothing plain, so I put some decorating on it." In the first 3 corners of her sign he'd carved a tree, a bird, and some waves. In the 4th corner he put the sun and the moon. He even carved a ribbon to go around all the words. You'd have swored it was real. Mr. Leroy let me carry it down to Mrs. Holston so he could put it over her door. Soon he drove the first nail into the wood over her door. Mrs. Holton came out to see what the commotion was. "Good afternoon, Leroy." "Good afternoon, Elijah." Me and Mr. Leroy both said, "Afternoon, ma'am." Mr. Leroy told her, "I's sorry, Sister Emmeline. I had the boy change them words around some. It was too long afore." She stepped outside, looked back up at the sign, and said, "Oh, what'd it say now?" I read it to her, and she smiled and said, "That's just what I wanted it to say, Elijah. Thank you kindly. And thank you kindly, Mr. Leroy, for doing such a grand job. I like the way you put them things in the corners. Made it look important." Pardon me for a minute. Mrs. Holton went back into her home. I figured she was getting some money to pay Mr. Leroy, but when she came back, she was holding on to a fancy carved box. She reached into the front of her apron and gave me a whole nickel. She gave me money for coming up with words on a piece of paper. I squeezed it tight in my hand and said, "Thank you, ma'am." But even before I could slide it down in my pocket, I could hear what Ma and Pa would say. I opened my palm and reached the nickel back to Mrs. Holton. I said, "I ain't allowed to take no one's money, ma'am." She wrapped her hand round my finger so the nickel was folded back up in my fist. "Elijah, I insist. If you ain't going to take it, I'm going to throw it out in the yard. I'll tell your ma I made you." That was good enough for me. Ma and Pa would think throwing money away was worse than taking it for doing someone a favor, so I didn't have nothing to worry about. Then Mrs. Holton looked at Mr. Leroy and said, "Sir, this here's for you." She reached the wood box at him. Mr. Leroy wrinkled his forehead for a bit and said, "Sister Emmeline, I appreciate you giving me this here box. It's some fine work, and in light of your loss, I must say we's even. But from now on, I can't be dealing in nothing but money. Sorry if I'm seeming bold, ma'am. I ain't intending to, but I know with you having someone what was slaved down home, you understand." Mrs. Holton said, "I understand. Here, open the box." Mr. Leroy took the box, pulled the lid off, and both him and me sucked in air like we got dunked in a barrel of cold water. His hands commenced shaking. He busted out in a sweat and looked like his belly was aching him bad. He grabbed a hold of his left arm, then whispered, "Mrs. Holton, what's this?" Mrs. Holton said, "It's $2,200 in gold, Mr. Leroy. It's what I was going to buy John Holton with. You need it more'n me now." Mr. Leroy couldn't talk. His legs melted from under him, and he ended up in a heap on Mrs. Holton's stoop. He said, "Mrs. Holton, this here'll be my wife and both my children. I, I, I can't turn this down." "I ain't 'spectin' you would." She walked over to where he fell, and he wrapped his arms around her legs like a drowning man holding onto a tree in a flood. He kept on mumbling, "I can't turn it down. I can't turn it down." It was something terrible to see. In two shakes of a lamb's tail, all the groanedness I'd been showing lately flew off like ducks off a pond, and I was a fragile boy all over again. Seeing someone strong and tough as Mr. Leroy crying made me feel like everything was turning topsy-turvy. Next thing you knowed, all three of us were bawling on Mrs. Holton's stoop. She pulled me into her, and we were a doggone pathetic sight. Mr. Leroy said, "Sister Emmeline, I done already have $1,192.85. I ain't gonna need all this, but I swear I'm gonna pay you back. I swear it. And you ain't never gonna have to worry about no work being done on your land for the rest of your life." Mr. Leroy didn't even wipe the tears away. He was crying, but started smiling at the same time. "You ought to see my oldest, 'Zekiel. He was a big strapping boy when I last seen him 4 years ago, and now he be 15 and must be big as an oak. Me and him both gonna be at your beck and call, ma'am. I swear it. We gonna pay you back every cent. Thank you, thank you." Mrs. Holton said, "Mr. Leroy, I ain't got no doubt you gonna pay me back, but hearing that Liberty Bell toll and your wife and babies walk into Buxton gonna be near payment enough itself." She sniffed into the kerchief she was holding out and said, "Elijah, read what them words is to me one more time. I toiled on 'em so long I didn't even have to look at the sign above Mrs. Holton's door." I swallowed down some of the looseness in my nose and said what was on the sign. "For the love of my husband, John Holton, who passed on May 7th, 1859, but still lives, the body is not made to endure. There's something inside so strong, it flies forever." She said, "That's it, Elijah. Son, you done told the truth. I think all three of us figured the other two weren't going to quit bawling till we busted up one from the nother." Mrs. Holton was the first to untangle herself from the crying party when her two children saw what was going on and commenced bawling too. She kissed me and Mr. Leroy on our heads, then closed her door kind o' gentle. I was next to leave. It was getting late, and I didn't want no trouble from Ma, so I left Mr. Leroy sitting on one of the steps with his face pressed down on that box. I ran all the way home to tell Ma and Pa the good news.